Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we're going to be discussing the proposed designation of the Houthi movement as a foreign terrorist organization. This is sort of a last-ditch effort by the Trump administration to really just screw everybody in Yemen, even worse than they already have. We'll go into detail on that, but first, some preliminaries. For those of you who are new here, what goes on is we have like sort of a presentation that I do. Maybe it'll be a half hour, maybe it'll be 45 minutes. And then we'll have Q&A for the balance of the 2 hours. Maybe it'll be a little less than 2 hours if the presentation is shorter, who knows. We're doing this, we usually do just one public live chat a month, but this month, because I'm in the midst of a fundraising push, we're going to be doing three, count them three, this week in the hopes that people will sign up and vote on what this channel's next new project is going to be. You can find all kinds of details around that at the channel itself, figuring out what my next new project is going to be, whether it's going to be Israel, Palestine, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, or just US empire more generally. I think it's a fun thing, and I think also contributing to independent media is getting more and more important as time goes on. So there'll be a lot more pitching at the end, but just want to point out why we're doing so many live chats this week. Before we get into the details of this Houthi designation, just the ground rules here. There's a live chat. You can see it going on. The live chat is a lot of fun. It's a free-for-all. Folks talk about all manner of things. You're encouraged to talk about all manner of things. You're encouraged to be as strident in talking about ideas as you want to be. You are encouraged to talk about me to any extent that you want, whether I sound stupid, whether I look stupid, whether my beard looks stupid, whatever. Say what you want. Say what you want about me. Go for it. What we ask is that you not be abusive to each other. You have to respect the other people in the chat. You don't necessarily have to respect their ideas, but you have to engage with each other respectfully. Loga Cool Extreme is the moderator. He is in the chat to make sure that you hold on to that basic respect for each other. There is no court of appeal from Loga. If he decides that you are being disruptive, insulting, or disruptive in some other way, he will warn you once. If you do not change your behavior in response to Loga's warning, then you will be blocked from the chat. There is no appeal from that. So with that out of the way, let's talk the Houthis and what the Trump administration is proposing to do to them. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the Houthis, which are a difficult topic for me. I've got a whiteboard where I write up, the scripts that I intend to write. And I've been trying to write, I've read books and I've been trying to write a video on the topic of what's a Houthi and how we should feel about them. It's just difficult for me, frankly. It's because the Houthis, let's be honest, like the Houthis are kind of shitty. They're not great. But what they are is a largely indigenous group responding to a foreign invasion. So that's kind of confusing. But I think it's a kind of confusion that often comes up. The forces that pull themselves together, that align themselves against foreign invasion are rarely very pretty. But anyway, so we'll talk about the Houthis for a chunk of time. We'll talk about sort of the bureaucratic minutia of what the Trump administration is trying to do to the Houthis and what those impacts might be. We'll talk about that very briefly because it's boring and it's hard to understand, which is, of course, part of the problem. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the sort of imperial ramifications about this are, because well beyond whether or not the Houthis are good people, well beyond the actual effects of this designation, if it goes forward, on the war in Yemen and the humanitarian situation, well beyond any of those considerations, what the Trump administration is proposing to do here is a new vast expansion of this sort of rolling US imperial power that is slowly, as I argued in the trailer I put out on Tuesday for this Channels Next to project being the story of American empire. This is very much, if this step were taken, it very much would be one more step towards U.S. world empire and the United States basically presuming to control a whole nother aspect of human life on this planet. So there's not something I'm a huge fan of. But I'm not a huge fan of this move at any level. I think the first thing to point out is that, yes, the Houthis are not great folks. They're actually, that's one of the problems here, is that with the Trump administration proposing designating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. To be clear, like foreign terrorist organization, that's a legally defined topic, legally defined concept under U.S. law. And if the Secretary of State, the head of the U.S. State Department, who is currently Mike Pompeo, designates them as a foreign terrorist organization, there are all kinds of very real legal implications of that. I've talked about on this channel the sort of who's a terrorist, who's not a terrorist. It's always political, sort of up in the air bullshit. It's all depends on where you're sitting and what you think. I mean, most human beings acknowledge that things like the Islamic State or the 9/11 hijackers, those are obviously terrorists. That's obvious to anybody. I would argue that the fact that the U.S. and Israel are currently acting to destroy civilian infrastructure in Iran, yeah, that's pretty obviously terrorism as well. But again, I wouldn't expect many people in the United States or Israel to agree with that definition. And that's sort of what I'm saying, is that terrorism is always sort of this up in the air, who really knows? It just depends on where you sit. But if the Houthis are designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the US government, then there are very real legal consequences. Crucially, not just for the Houthis, who actually, the Houthis, there's very little direct way for the US at this point to affect the Houthis. The Houthis, as an article I was just reading said, the Houthis don't have, foreign bank accounts. They don't have a lot of, sort of glamorous jet-setting diplomats. This is not, I mean, it is a very bare bones organization that has power because it controls the vast majority of Yemen and Yemeni territory. It's not like normally, it's threatening to say a Chinese businessman or Russian businessman, the US sanctions. For the Houthis on the ground at the moment, it won't make much difference. Honestly, I think a foreign terrorist designation for the Houthis could actually make them more powerful. What it would mean for everybody else is that there would be US sanctions and strictures on everybody else in the world's interactions with the Houthis. And the Houthis are not, some guys in caves plotting nasty plots. The Houthis are the government of Yemen. I think there are very few people who will be honest with you about that. Very few news sources who will be honest with you about that. They even though I think most right-thinking people, most people who've looked at the question in the slightest will tell you what Saudi Arabia and the official Yemeni government are doing. Yemen is insane and evil and needs to be stopped. Even the US Congress, generally folks who love bombing anything, acknowledge that what the Saudi government is doing to Yemen is horrific. But even though that's the case, everybody still talks about Yemen as if Yemen has a internationally recognized government that's not the Houthis. That is the Hadi government that I think was elected once, maybe, 5 or 6 years ago. And this government under, was it Ahmed Rabah? Forgotten his entire name, but Hadi has lived in Riyadh for almost the entire duration of this war. The Saudi invaders and the UAE controlled a rim of territory on sort of the coast of Yemen. And this is one of my biggest, if there was one thing that I wish that journalists and the general public would acknowledge, is that where the deserts are. If you look at a map, a control map of Yemen, it looks like the Houthis just control this little sliver of territory in the west of the country. Of course, if you actually know about Yemen's geography, you realize that that vast amount of territory that the Saudis or the UAE affiliated militias supposedly hold is just fucking desert. I mean, that's not true. I mean, there are, Hadramaut, Aden, these are real places, but they are real. They are not where the majority of Yemenis live. The majority of Yemenis live in territory that has been controlled by the Houthis since late 2014 at this point. So for at least 6 years, all of the billions of dollars that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the United States have poured into unseating the Houthis has not been effective. The Houthis control territory. The Houthis control the vast majority of Yemen. The Houthis are really the only government that Yemen has. And that is the thing that is so disturbing and so unprecedented about the United States attempting to designate the entire government of an area as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, this may be a little confusing to folks because I've actually covered recently on this channel sort of the issue of Sudan being designated as a state sponsor of terror. Now, these are completely different. These are completely different. To be designated as a state sponsor of terrorism and to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization are completely distinct topics that should be at least completely distinct topics. I mean, I don't know, I don't want to make any kind of broader statements about the sort of legitimacy or the sense of these designations. I do tend to think that these designations are mostly political, but they are very different things. If you designate a state, as Sudan was, as Iran is, as I think many states have been at different levels at different periods of time, if you designate a state sponsor of terrorism, there is an acknowledgement that there are different levels of approaches to this. Maybe there's only certain people in those governments that need to be sanctioned. Maybe, in the case of Iran, of course, we just sanction everything, but maybe there's, there are levels of this. There's complexity to this. And if you're designated as a state sponsor of terrorism, there's established pathways for there to be humanitarian aid to your people if there need to be. It's an understanding that it's a complex, multifaceted thing, and it's got its whole history and legal structure and whatnot. This is being a sponsor of terrorism. To be designated as a foreign terrorist organization is something that's much more sweeping. It's not something that's designed to designate a group a foreign terrorist organization. This is like a cancer that is meant to be rooted out entirely. Anybody who has any interaction with a foreign terrorist organization also needs to be sanctioned. A foreign terrorist organization is something that can be destroyed entirely, whereas a state sponsor of terror is acknowledged to be a government that is responsible for people. There's more facets to this entity. It's sort of a sick entity that needs to be, not that I'm endorsing this idea that the US should take these kinds of powers, but this is sort of the thinking of designating a state sponsor of terrorism. It's something that needs to be fixed. A foreign terrorist organization is something that needs to be wiped out entirely. And it is horrifying that even, after all of the destruction that has been wrought on the Yemeni people, that the US government is now contemplating designating the entire government of Yemen as a foreign terrorist organization that must be wiped out and sort of extirpated. It is grim. It is genocidal. I don't think anybody in, the Trump administration or Mike Pompeo's State Department is smart enough or aware enough of what it is they're proposing here. But no, it is genocidal in intent. I think that gets a little. Keep in mind. So what this is an extreme extension of the concept of what a foreign terrorist organization is and what should be done. It's the second step that the Trump administration would be taking. I want to finish talking about the Houthis before I get into how this would be the second step after the designation of the IRGC that the Trump administration had taken. The Houthis. I have read I guess, a couple books at this point on the Houthis, attempting to sort of explain what they are. And it's very interesting because it just doesn't, it's a concept that I guess is it's just a little too far from my understanding for me to be able to do it justice. That's why I'm having such trouble drafting videos on this. It's got something to do with Yemen's sort of tribal nature. I don't want to sound like orientalizing or essentializing or like, racist in like, the way that I describe it. It is just a different way of organizing a society from the one that I am familiar with. Houthis are often described as a sectarian organization, and they absolutely are. I think that there is a religious aspect to the organization, but that shouldn't distract you from the tribal and the independence-oriented aspects of this organization. The Houthi organization would never have been as powerful as it is. This is not everything about the Houthi organization, because like I said, there are these tribal aspects as well that are vitally important. But it would not be anywhere near as powerful as it was if the Saudi government hadn't poured billions of dollars into forcing Wahhabi Sunni Islam on Yemen. The traditional ruling class in Yemen is something called Zaidi Shia. And that's actually not even, it's a form of Shia that's actually much closer to Sunni Islam than it is to the Shia Islam of Iran. However, it is a distinct belief. It is a local sort of indigenous view of Islam and of religion and a way of life. In the 70s, 80s, especially the 80s, when they were looking to recruit people for their crusade in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia used its fire hose of money against a very poor country to unseat the traditional religious life of Yemen. And the Houthis are, in part, a reaction against that. Now, what's interesting is you have Houthis who are Zaidi Shia. You can actually have, this was something I was just most interested to learn, you can have strongly Sunni members of the Houthi movement. Because what's really fundamental, and there's in some ways this is wrapped up with Shia belief, but I don't want to delve into that, but it's this concept of justice and the abuse of a leader and how it is the duty of the people to unseat an unjust leader. And that unjust leader, ironically, because they ended up working together eventually before the Houthis eventually killed him, but that unjust leader in the period of time when the Houthi movement was rising was Saleh. And Saleh was seen accurately, I believe, though, of course, Saleh was pretty good at playing everybody against each other. Saleh was seen accurately as a tool of the Saudis, and the Saudis and Saleh as tools of the United States. So it's this Houthi thing that was resistance to the dictator, who did not treat the Houthis with respect. And this fascinating book that I read, I do regret not having the title and name for you, by this woman who really traced the way that the Houthi movement grew from sort of a tiny kernel of a weird little faith movement in one corner of Sada province. And it grew not because of religious stuff, but mostly because of the repression that Saleh, the US, and the Saudis had put on the Houthi movement. So the Houthis would sort of stand up and create problems. Nobody really cared that much. Then, of course, the Saleh's government would come in, crush everything in the region as mercilessly as possible, and then all of a sudden the Houthi movement had more adherents. So these Houthis that adhered to so the folks along sort of tribal lines of loyalty and anger. And the anger is key here. So you could have like a Sunni chief in an area that was the target of repression to defeat the Houthis, that felt that he was being disrespected and would therefore join the Houthis. It's a fascinating, it's sort of an organism I don't quite understand. I haven't quite wrapped my head around it. What's interesting, of course, and the way that we've now spoken for 20 minutes about what the Houthis might be, and I think that's probably more than they've been covered anywhere in sort of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the CNN, Fox News, because it's very easy to point to what the Houthis are and how the Houthis are evil, because you just have to look to the Houthis' main slogan, which is almost perfectly geared towards an American looking at this slogan and saying, I don't need to think about these people anymore. Fuck them. I think that's a poor choice on the Houthis' part. But what's interesting is you have to understand the context that this grew out of. The Houthi movement sort of became what it was with the martyrdom of a member of the Houthi family who was sort of the leader at that point in, I think, 2004. However, this sort of grew up during the period of the Second Intifada. I've talked recently on this channel the way that during the Second Intifada, I guess it's sort of, 98 through 04 is what they say. I, as somebody in the United States who was just watching bombs go off in Tel Aviv, I was like, what the fuck? Fuck Arabs. I became very racist in my reaction to this. The Arab world was watching, was watching whatever repressive actions Israel was taking in response to that in the West Bank and Gaza. Embarrassing how little I know about what those actually are, but sort of shows you where I was sitting during the Second Intifada. The Arab world was sitting in a place where they were watching the repression of Palestinians. So they came up with this slogan, which is Allah is greater, death to America, death to Israel, curse upon the Jews, victory to Islam. So yeah, that's not gonna, and that's sort of the concern here, because the Houthis have a lot of aspects to who they are, who they call themselves, how they define themselves, that make it real hard to take them off of a terrorism list once they're all put on it. And that's the thing. So looking at the statutes governing this, if Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration were to take the Houthis and put them onto a terrorism list, it could be instantly wiped away by an action of Congress. But if that were to happen, you wouldn't have any Republicans who'd be willing to help you with that. And if the Democrat, because it's something that Trump did, and they can't wipe away something that Trump did, and there are plenty of people in the Democratic Party who are stupid enough and who are in hoc enough to the military-industrial complex that when somebody comes up with a big printout, and yeah, I mean, the Houthis are kind enough to provide English language translations of this slogan. They will put that up in Congress, and nobody's going to vote to take the Houthis off of the foreign terrorist organization list. Now, what's interesting, because this was sort of swimming in the ether. Like, the way this slogan was used was that in mosques, when somebody from the government would get up and try to give a speech, try to give up. This is before the Houthis controlled any territory other than traditional tribal territory in corners of the Sada province. Throughout the country, as a active resistance against Saleh, the Saudi U.S. puppet, who they were eventually allied with. But it's a very long and complicated story that I've got usually I write videos that are about 600 or 700 to 1,000 to 1,200 words. I've got a video that attempts to describe like how the Saudi Arabia has lost the Yemeni War of Independence. It's a video that's about, I think it's 3,000 words now. It's going to be like a 20, 25-minute video when I ever produce it. Very complicated stuff. Saleh is a fascinatingly weird character. But anyway, so this slogan came about when Saleh was mercilessly repressing everybody in Yemen and was seen as a Saudi, US, Israeli pawn. So in mosques, what people would do is they would start shouting this slogan. This is during the period of the Second Intifada when Palestinians were being, to this view, murdered by the Israelis. So you can see sort of where this slogan comes from. It is about resistance, and I think that where I come down on the Houthis is that, yeah, they're an ugly fucking group of people. They've got this slogan that's nasty. They've pretty effectively taken over the entire country through the use of some fairly vicious methods. They are, I mean, they're bad news. But the reason that they're bad news, the reason that they exist is because actors like Saudi Arabia, the United States, have been attempting to crush the urge for independence of the Yemeni people for decades. The Houthis are ugly, they are vicious, they are mean because the Houthis are revolutionaries. This is what fighting for independence in a real way looks like. It's rough. Even, and of course, you know, as the decades wear on, as the revolutionaries recede into history, into a successful polity or nation state, they get airbrushed. You know, they get cleaned up. You know, nobody really pays attention so much. Well, actually, I think it's probably one of the most famous under-recognized things. But you know, the French revolutionaries, you know, genocided a bunch of Catholic peasants in the Vendée. Even, you know, I say even in the United States, of course, the revolutionary generation of the United States, there were slave drivers who eagerly wiped out all of the indigenous people. It was horrific. But even what I think is surprising, and folks haven't internalized, but the U.S. revolutionary generation also sort of, to a degree, the degree possible in the 18th century, sort of ethnically cleansed the 13 colonies of the United States of people who were loyal to the British king. That's what Canada was. I mean, Canada was initially populated by French Canadians, and then the first real English-speaking population that Canada had was folks who wanted to retain loyalty to the king, often some very wealthy people in New York specifically. So yeah, I mean, yeah, the Houthis, they absolutely attempt to hijack humanitarian stuff for their own needs. They absolutely commit horrible acts to people in Yemeni politics who are perceived to be against them. As, by the way, do Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I think it was recently it came out that the UAE actually uses U.S. mercenaries for death squads against political figures in Yemen that they don't like. And that's the crucial distinction that I would ask you to remember when thinking about the Houthis. Yes, these are savage, nasty people, but they are Yemenis. And they are acting in response to and doing similarly horrific things to what Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are doing to a country that is not their own. This is a really basic, really fundamental thing that nobody in US media wants to talk about, and it is enraging. We got into the Middle East. We started occupying the Middle East in earnest in 1990 because we believed nominally in a principle that countries should not be invading other countries. We are now allied with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia as they invade and attempt to control Yemen, a different country. And that's, of course, what this attempt to designate Yemen as a foreign terrorist organization is very much about. So let's talk a little bit about what this would do. So yes, as I pointed out, you know, a state sponsor of terrorism, it's someone you can work with, but only in certain ways, endless complexity, what have you. A foreign terrorist organization is something to be extirpated. It is something to be eliminated. It is something to be destroyed. And anybody who helps or interacts with a foreign terrorist organization in any way is to be extirpated and destroyed. Or no, is to be subject to extreme consequences. So that would mean, remember, 80% of Yemenis live in territory controlled by the Houthis, and something like, I didn't look at it, 70 to 80% of the people in Yemen are completely dependent on humanitarian provision from the United Nations and from other organizations. So if the Houthis, the only real Yemeni government, are designated as a terrorist, a foreign terrorist organization by the United States government, then the United Nations or any other humanitarian organization is then subject to sanctions. Now, as with the horrific sanctions that have been placed against Syria and Iran and are starving people to death and wiping out their medical systems and visiting great horror against those countries, there are absolutely, and there totally would be, if the Houthis were designated, there will totally be exemptions for humanitarian and medical stuff. We swear they'll definitely, if you just check off this box, 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 and funnel your money through this one organization, then sure, humanitarian goods can totally get into Yemen. And that's sort of horseshit, because humanitarian organizations, some of them are absolutely bloated and corrupt and whatnot, and some of them are doing really important, really important work, and don't have the spare money to hire top shelf corporate attorneys to figure out how they could possibly deliver money to the starving Yemeni people. And a lot of these organizations have many different countries that they focus on. So they're going to say, well, look, if we risk by interacting with the Houthis, if we risk being subject to U.S. sanctions, then I guess we just won't. I guess we'll just focus on helping the Tigrayans in Ethiopia, or we'll just focus on any one of a number of other humanitarian issues, because this Yemen thing or this Iran thing or this Syria thing, it's just too complicated for us, and we don't want to risk it. And I think that's sort of an underappreciated story of every kind of U.S. sanction, is that, yeah, sure, every kind of U.S. sanction says, well, no, of course we don't stop medicine or food or anything like that, but it's too complex for any of these humanitarian organizations to risk the involvement at all. So that's a really key cost if the Houthis were designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Diplomacy, and it looks like there's, of course, it can always look this way, but there is an ongoing process. There are discussions ongoing between the Houthis and the United Nations, and it's funny because there is no, and the Yemeni government based in Riyadh, the Houthi government at some points controlled Aden, which is a big city that is important, but they were pushed out of it by southern separatists who aren't even affiliated with the Houthis. The Yemeni government has no legitimacy, and I think that's something that the Yemeni government recognizes, and they recognize that the U.S. Congress is against this ongoing war. And there is a diplomatic process that is proceeding, and that I think as soon as Biden is in office, could proceed very quickly and could get to a point where it's like, okay, like, let's resolve this. Let's stop the horrific embargo that Saudi Arabia and the United States and the United Kingdom already maintain on Yemen. People are absolutely starving to death in Yemen because of a U.S. enforced embargo. Like, let's figure out how to stop the horror. And I think that a lot of things are in place to make quick progress towards a better result in Yemen for everybody. God, even for the Saudis, who are just, it's their Vietnam. They're just bleeding away billions to no purpose. Like we could get there very, very quickly. Designating the Houthis, the most important actor in Yemen, as a foreign terrorist organization, stops that just immediately. Like, that's just it, boom. Like, that's it. Nobody's allowed to interact with them. And yeah, that's a really, really, really terrible fucking idea. I hope I've made that clear. So I think I've talked about how, foreign terrorist organization is very different from state sponsor of terror. But this isn't the first time that the Trump administration has blurred those lines. And it's a very stupid thing to do, quite frankly. The first blurring of these lines came in April of 2019, when the Trump administration designated the the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Is that it? Anyway, designated the IRGC, a part of the Iranian government, as a foreign terrorist organization. And within half a year of that, we saw, I guess, what, 8 months of that, we saw what the consequence was the United States assassinating the head of the IRGC when he was in Iraq to talk to the Iraqi government about, probably about maintaining their fight against the Islamic State. So yeah, like this isn't. I think that a lot of the coverage is focused on the way that this will instantly screw up, if this happens, the way this will instantly screw up humanitarian provision and will instantly lead to more death and destruction within Yemen. I think that's been a big focus. But also, we already added a government to the list of foreign terrorist organizations, and we already, killed the head of that part of that government. So this is absolutely designating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization is absolutely a way to justify any further violence against them. So, I mean, to this point, while the U.S. has absolutely been supporting Saudi military forces in Yemen, I think probably if Trump had won, I think this sort of foreign terrorist organization designation would have been an excuse for a much more open U.S. escalation against the Houthis. And I'm sorry, I guess I didn't. I don't think I emphasized this enough earlier. The Houthis, despite their nasty slogan, have never taken any action against the United States or even Israel, who they supposedly hate so much. The Houthis have controlled territory on the border of the Bab el Mandab Strait? Is that it? Jesus. Wow. It's not the Persian Gulf. That's on the other side. It's the Red Sea, right? God, man, geography, huh? The Houthis have controlled territory on one of the most important shipping lanes on the planet. If the Houthis had wanted to take terrorist actions against U.S. shipping, U.S. petroleum, Israeli shipping, Israeli petroleum, they could have done so at any moment. They have taken actions against Saudi cities, Saudi infrastructure, because the Saudis are actively attempting to actively destroying Yemeni hospitals, Yemeni cities, Yemeni what have you. That's straightforward. This isn't terrorism. This is straight on like state-on-state war. And if the U.S. essentially declares war against the Houthis, does that mean that the Houthis would start acting against U.S. shipping? I think probably not, because I think the Houthis recognize that if they take that step, there would be instant and massive and horrific repercussions. But this sort of opening the door to actual conflict between the Houthis and the United States is also just fucking nuts, because the Houthis have very carefully, I believe, avoided real conflict with the United States and Israel. They have not taken terrorist actions against the United States, which also, and this is in the statute, that a foreign terrorist organization should be something that has taken out terrorist acts against the United States or endangers U.S. national security in some other way. And if you look at my entire corpus of 30 videos now on Yemen, I think it's pretty damn clear that the U.S. has no national security interest that is helped by crushing the Houthis. So that's just a really, really key thing here. So yeah, I think we can say very confidently that the U.S. designation of a section of the Iranian government as a terrorist organization in April of 2019 has had no positive effects, none of the claimed effects of deterring Iran, making the Iranian government fall. None of that shit has ever happened. And it has brought us to the brink of another $1 trillion wasted war in the Middle East. It's fucking stupid. It is not something that should be replicated. And in this capacity, with Iran, there was still an acknowledgement that the Iranian government is more than the IRGC. It's more than this foreign terrorist organization. In Yemen, what the Trump administration is seeking to do is to designate the entire legitimate government, not the officially internationally recognized, but the legitimate government that has always controlled, has for the past 6 years controlled the vast majority of Yemeni population and territory that's worthwhile. Basically, when you see that the Trump administration wants to designate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, don't think of it that way. No, the Trump administration wants to designate the majority of the Yemeni people and their only functioning government as a foreign terrorist organization. This is insane. This is, leaving aside the very real consequences for the Yemeni people, this is the consequences for the United States and its sort of steady creep into a really vicious and nasty worldwide empire. This is another key step on that path. What's interesting is, let's talk specifically about what that jump forward is here. There has always been, with Israel and the United States, a sort of special relationship. And it's interesting because I believe back in the 80s or the 90s, there were absolutely Hezbollah affiliated or Hezbollah adjacent activities that did go after US people, US citizens. But I think to a large extent, the designation of Hamas and Hezbollah, organizations that mostly just attack Israel, is because, half of Israel, I have not looked at the figures, but my assumption is a very significant proportion of Israelis also have US passports. They're also US citizens, and yes, the United States has a special relationship with Israel, and any attack upon Israel is generally considered to be an attack on us. Leaving aside the wisdom or foolishness of that concept, that is a sort of established concept. Of course, what that does is it opens up, this concept, okay, this place is a special ally, and any attack on this special ally is an attack on the United States. So that's why we're designating these organizations that only attack Israel as terrorist organizations. Like that, okay, I'm sure there are many people listening to this right now who think that's a really dumb fucking idea, but even assuming it's the best idea in the world, it's probably in the interest of Israelis and the United States that special status remains something that's only applied to Israel. What we're trying to do here is to apply that status to another ally that is completely unworthy of it, which is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is absolutely attacked by the Houthis because Saudi Arabia invaded Yemen, because Saudi Arabia invaded Yemen's country. That is a war that is ongoing. But if we decide that Saudi Arabia now gets the same status as Israel, and any activity taken against Saudi Arabia is automatically, something that means you have to be wiped out. That's a real fucked up step, wiped out in this way. I mean, we have treaty alliances. We have Article 5 in NATO. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. But this idea that this government that is doing really nothing other than resisting against the Saudi Arabian invasion is automatically deserving of FTO designation. That's a step. That's a bad step. So yeah, I think that's about 45 minutes. I think that's pretty much what I have to say about this foreign terror designation. I think it's a really bad fucking idea, and we shouldn't do it. And I think it really is. There's no reason for it other than to fuck over the Biden administration. And if this happens, now I still believe that the Biden administration, or at least Biden himself, many elements of the Biden administration, intend to get back into the Iran nuclear deal as soon as possible. They've said that's what they want to do. I acknowledge that that's going to be tremendously difficult. That's going to be a hard thing to do. That's going to be a hard thing to pull off. And if Trump has successfully added the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, the diplomatic process to resolve the Yemeni war will stop. And Biden doesn't have unlimited political capital. You know, a president can really only focus on one tremendously difficult thing at a time. And getting resolving this issue is a tremendously difficult thing if the Houthis are on the foreign terrorist organization. Remember, I said earlier that, okay, yeah, sure, Congress can get rid of this at any time. But you'd have to convince the Congress that people with a slogan like that and a flag that says "Death to Israel" on it don't belong on a terrorist list. And I think, you know, as I think made clear in this presentation, I don't believe they belong on the terrorist list. But, you know, explaining that to the representative from Texas with all his evangelical constituents, or you know, the representative from some suburb that has a lot of Zionist sympathy or something like that. Like, yeah, it's going to be real fucking hard. So yeah, if there's a distinct chance that this FTO designation could stop the Yemeni war from being resolved in any way, because Biden, I think quite rightly, would focus his political capital on getting the Iran nuclear deal signed. So this is a really just horrific parting shot by the Trump administration that could keep a war that everybody agrees needs to end going. So it's just a terrible idea. All right, so questions. Oh man, we're discussing Islamic schools of thought, huh? That seems like fun. Do we have a question? Do we have a question? I don't have an opinion on the Hanafi school or the Hanbali school or Maliki school. There's another one, I think, but I don't recall what those are. Inonu points out that Georgia will be critical for Dems to actually do anything for the next 4 years, which is very true. Do we have any questions in the live chat? Any questions at all? I just want to say happy holidays for everyone. Ahmad CI asks, what's Iran's reaction to this going to be, do you think? Well, I think, and maybe I should have emphasized this earlier, this is not something that has happened yet. You know, I think the pushback, what's interesting is the pushback against this proposition is near universal. You know, sure, I'm sure the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or, you know, those other clown show Raytheon think tanks, you know, they would probably be all for it. Sure, everybody's a terrorist. You know, everybody in the world other than the United States and Israel are terrorists, and they should all be bombed. But I think even among serious Iran hawks, like serious people who really believe that Iran is a serious threat. I mean, you know, not very intelligent people, obviously, but you know, like earnest people who really are concerned about Iran, or, you know, the Shia crescent, or think that's a real thing. Even they are saying that the idea of designating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization is a really stupid idea, because I think everybody acknowledges at this point that everybody sane, or everybody who honestly cares about Yemenis even a little bit, realizes that, you know, some kind of negotiation is necessary. I'm not even sure the Saudis want well, probably they do, but I mean, you know, the Saudis want this war to end. Yeah, I don't even think they'd be for it. So yeah, this isn't necessary. For this to happen, this would be like a true, just like, yeah, it would be a true just fuck you to absolutely everybody. Which, you know, is what you can see the Trump administration doing that right now with its derailing of the stimulus. I think it's the stimulus, the budget for the next year, and the defense authorization. Yeah, so if Trump's going to spend the end of his time in office screwing up things that vital, there's no reason to think that he wouldn't you know, designate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, even though everybody agrees that that'd be a terrible fucking idea. So yeah, what would Iran's reaction be? I don't think Iran would particularly give a shit. Frankly, it's not like it puts any additional hoops on them. And honestly, it would probably be good for Iran, because what would happen if the Houthis were designated is that, I mean, it's already horrific what's happening in Yemen. We've got at least 250,000 people dead, I'd guess. I don't know. We're all just sort of estimating. But if humanitarian aid was significantly disrupted, there would be millions of people dying over the next 6 months in Yemen. Millions of people dying in a country of only 30 million people. And it would be directly attributable to US and Saudi action. There would be no other way to look at it. And yeah, that'd be a tremendous victory for Iran. So yeah, maybe Iran would prefer the Houthis were designated as a foreign terrorist organization. It just makes them look better. So yeah, it's key. It's interesting. I think I may have in the past on live chats gone a little too far in the direction of the Houthis have nothing to do with Iran. I don't know, and that's not accurate. Like, looking into it in more detail, yes, the Houthis and Iran have long-term connections. This does not mean that the Iranians control the Houthis. I would argue that the Iranians have significantly less influence over the Houthis than they do over Hezbollah. The Houthis are absolutely independent decision makers from Iran, but yes, they are supported by Iran to some extent. Interestingly, not until 2011, when the Saudis started funding the attempts to overthrow the Iranian client in Assad. It was only after that, in 2011, that the Iranians started funding, nowhere near to the extent that the Saudis funded the anti-Assad jihadists, but started funding the Houthis in their attempt to wipe Saudi influence out of Yemen. Okay, True Realist says, do you think Libya, in a super chat, thank you, do you think Libya will be a priority for Biden? I don't think so. No, I do not think. I think what's in, and I think that's almost, well, I don't know. A U.S. president who decided to make Libya a focus could say, like, the UN approved government is the US approved government. Everybody get in line. Stop doing all this proxy horse shit. And Haftar, come back to the US and retire in the Virginia suburbs where you spent most of the past 3 decades. Like, the US could absolutely do that. The US will not do that. I think it's about political capital. The United States needs, France and Egypt and the UAE and yes, even the fucking Saudis on board for other diplomatic things. It's important, or even just to offend them for other diplomatic things. France and Russia relationships will be improved with the Biden administration if they get back into the Iran nuclear deal. But if Biden gets back into the Iran nuclear deal, then he's really going to piss off the Saudis and the UAE, which shouldn't matter so much, but they buy a lot of weapons. And now I think they actually, the underappreciated aspect is that they, with all the billions that MBS has taken out of the Saudi economy to drop into the US stock market, this is other, I think that's, the Saudis could probably end the stock market bubble very quickly. There are some important aspects, not as important as France and Russia, of course. So if the U.S. is telling Saudi Arabia and the UAE, fuck you, we're doing deals with Iran, we're going to try and finally bring peace to the region, it's not like Biden's also going to be like, oh yeah, and by the way, your client in Libya, fuck that, you can't do that either. So like, there will, famously, horrifically, the reason that the Yemeni war started was because Obama said to Saudi Arabia, well, I know you feel bad about this Iran nuclear deal we're trying to do. We'll let you go invade Yemen. So while I hope and pray that Biden won't be that fucking dumb in his reaction to, in bribing, his way of bribing the Saudis and the Qataris. I don't think beyond the Iran nuclear deal thing that Biden's going to be looking for reasons to piss off the Saudis and the UAE. So yeah, I think probably Libya will be sort of sacrificed for another number of years, which it means it's sort of on the Libyans and it's on the Turks and it's on the French and the Russians and all of their proxies and clients to sort of decide what happens in Libya. So yeah, I do not think Libya will be a priority for Biden. Questions. Hafiz Farouk says Wahhabism is a slur label developed by Ottoman and British empires to suppress any opposition. It's a vague term with no real meaning. It was based on lies. Your answer. I disagree. I think there's a lot of people who are very invested in this idea that there is one true Islam, and people who say that there's a distinct version of Saudi Islam that's more extreme or nastier. They're wrong because all Islam is the same, and there's one right way to do Islam. I don't want to get into the arena of telling people what their religious beliefs are or ought to be, but I think people who believe that there is one true Islam or one true Christianity or one true Scientology just don't understand people very well, don't understand history very well, and probably don't understand religion very well. But I couldn't say that because I'm not a religious person. And I think that Wahhabism, though of course the Saudis famously hate it, I think it is a very useful definition of, I mean, maybe it would be more straightforward to say Saudi Islam, but that would, of course, I think make people even angrier. The truth is, and one of the great horrors that Saudi Arabia wrought was a form of cultural genocide over the past half century, over 1,000 years in some places, 1,400 years in many places, and fewer years, as it spread. An extraordinary wealth or richness of Islamic belief and practice grew up in interaction with the cultures that were initially conquered, or I believe in Southeast Asia, Islam mostly traveled by trade. This incredible wealth of diversity and this extraordinary richness of Islamic culture. That was very localized, was very, every sort of geographical region had its own interaction with traditions and a variety of international traditions. It's an extraordinary thing. And the Saudis came in over the past half century, it was more than that now, and stomped on it, tried to wipe it all out, tried to crush any religious diversity. The Saudis carried out a form of religious cultural genocide against Islamic practice. And I think now that there's more forms of wealth building up throughout the world, there are that's falling away, and I think that's a fantastic thing. But I absolutely believe that. Well, of course, Wahhabism isn't, an acknowledged sect with a particular approach. I believe that Wahhabism is absolutely a useful label for the generalized ideology that the Saudis attempted to force on the world, and were much more effective in forcing on very close and very poor countries like Yemen. And that's why, of course, we have the horror we have today. Another super chat. What do we got here? True Realist. Thank you. A £5 super chat. Is the growing influence of Russia in Libya and the fact that France is aiding them not a big issue for the US? Also, why is Libya important for Turkey? Is the growing influence of Russia in Libya and the fact, that the United States doesn't really give a shit about Libya. I think that if you're looking for big red lines for the U.S. I think that, association with Iran is a big deal for the U.S. because Israel is a big deal for the U.S. And I think that, there absolutely, you look at Nord Stream 2, there are, we're beginning to fall further into this idea that any kind of friendliness to Russia is awful or evil. But honestly, like the idea that you could even get like a MSNBC to flip out about France being close to Russia and Libya, it's really hard to. You need an MSNBC audience that knew where Libya was, sort of beyond a tourist article that hasn't been coming out for a decade. So yeah, I think that the fact that the U.S. was ever involved in Libya at all, there's the lead from behind thing, which is a silly myth. This idea that the U.S. wasn't really involved in overthrowing Libya. That's simply not true. The English and French fighter jets, participated in the Libyan interaction after the U.S. fighter jets came in the night before and knocked out all of Gaddafi's anti-aircraft stuff. This was always about U.S. power, but as far as U.S. interest in this overthrowing Libya, that was very much driven by business interests within the U.S. and the U.K. Within France and the U.K. We've always been content to sort of let it be France's party. And getting pissed off that France is now on the same side as Russia in Libya would require, I think, more Americans paying more attention to what's actually going on than is likely, if that makes any sense. Also, why is Libya important for Turkey? Well, Libya actually occupies a huge part in sort of Turkish nationalist history. It was the Italian invasion of Libya, which to that point had been, to some degree, sometimes loosely, sometimes firmly, under Ottoman control. I think from the 1500s until the early 1900s. I think 1908 sticks in my mind. Maybe, yeah. Is that the same year that the Young Turks took over? Anyway, the Italians took advantage of disarray in Turkey to invade Libya, which had been Turkish territory for 500 years, and the new Turkish government got really invested in fending off the Italians, sent way too many military resources to try to defend Libya from the Italians, and then lost all of Eastern Europe, which it had control. I mean, they had much more significant chunks of Eastern Europe, much further into the 1900s than most people recognize, and they lost it in part because they diverted too many military resources to defend their honor from the Italians in Libya. So Libya is, there's a very serious history for the Turks in Libya. So that's certainly important. Why do they care about Libya today? I think it's mostly opportunism. The Turkish government is looking for reasons to flatter their nationalists and make Turkey look powerful and awesome. And what better place to do it than Libya, which has this deep history I just explained for the Turks, and also was conveniently destroyed by the United States and sort of left in ruins. So by committing, Turkey has committed to Libya to a much higher degree than Russia or France have. I think actually, did France commit some naval ships offshore at some point? I can't recall. But generally, I mean, it's mostly just funding proxies and arming proxies for France and Russia. Turkey, brought in mercenaries of their own. I believe absolutely has special forces on the ground. That's why Libya is important for Turkey, and of course the East Med gas dispute, and sort of as the price for Turkish intervention to save the government of national accord in Libya. Sort of as the price for that intervention, the government of national accord, the UN recognized government in Tripoli, had to sign a agreement on sort of rights to the Mediterranean between Libya and Turkey. And the agreement they signed is pretty inadmissible under international law. It basically says that a bunch of, not just, Greece has a lot of rights to territorial seas, going right up against the Turkish land that are inappropriate, I believe, and that should be adjudicated in some way. The deal that Turkey and Libya signed, divvying up the Mediterranean Sea, is flatly ridiculous. So that is another reason why Libya is important for Turkey. Yeah. Questions. Local Cool Extreme asks, what country actually poses the most legitimate threat to Saudi Arabia? Jordan. No, I don't know. Actually, yeah, Jordan, probably, right? Yeah, because Jordan, I mean, is ruled by the Hashemite family that was in control of the Hijaz. That's it, right? Was in control of Mecca and Medina until World War I believe. Actually, until the 1920s. So yeah, I think Jordan actually probably. When Saudi Arabia starts falling apart, it's going to be very interesting to see what the Jordanian king does. But I think Iran does pose a very real threat to Saudi Arabia. Not to the extent where Iran could ever want to take Saudi territory, as the Jordanians probably do, and honestly, as the Yemenis do, which I think would be a bad idea. I think is not something that anybody should endorse. But I think, yeah, the Houthis, I think, are quite interested in taking Saudi territory, and because the Saudi military is so apocalyptically bad, you can even imagine that. I don't think that's good. I think that the U.S. I desperately do not want the United States involved in the war in Yemen. But if the Houthis attempted to take Saudi territory, I do think it is in U.S. interests to stop that from happening, because I think it is in the U.S. and the world's interests to not allow borders to be revised. So yeah, I do think the Houthis present a real threat to Saudi Arabia, one that they created. I think that the Jordanians absolutely, though of course it's not something to be acknowledged or thought about, but as Saudi Arabia gets more and more shaky, as I believe it will over the course of this decade, who knows? Jordan, sort of a dark horse there. I don't believe Iran presents any territorial threat to Saudi Arabia. They're not interested in taking any territory, as the Saudis have been. The Saudis threatened to invade Qatar within the past 4 or 5 years. It's really fucked up. In addition to invading and occupying Yemen. But yeah, Iran has the capability to turn Saudi Arabia's petroleum industry into a smoking ruin. And I think that's the first thing that will happen in any U.S.-Iranian war. The U.S. can absolutely bomb Iranian territory with impunity for the United States. It's not like Iran has a missile they can send into U.S. territory. They will absolutely attempt to use their missiles to kill the U.S. soldiers that we are stupidly stationed throughout the Middle East, and Iran could conceivably do that. But if we started large-scale bombing of Tehran, the first, softest, easiest target that would be obliterated would be the Saudi oil industry. So yeah, that's a legitimate threat to Saudi Arabia. So yeah, I think Saudi Arabia's actions are stupid and poorly thought out almost all the time. But I think they are correct in that Iran presents a serious threat to them. Yet they've spent the past 40 years poking that bear as much as possible. And I think they began to see the potential consequences of that with the Abqaiq. I never pronounce it appropriately. It was 2019. Yeah, it was 2019, right? Or was it 2018 when nominally the Houthis, but very much with Iranian technology and quite possibly from Iran itself, destroyed almost, I think it was actually fairly light, but demonstrated that they could very easily destroy Saudi refining capacity. And that the US really didn't care, which is also interesting. Questions. If you do super chats, I will definitely answer your question. Questions. Do we have questions other than, let's see, questions. Okay, that's a very interesting question. So Turkey helps Libya recognize government good. Saudi Arabia helped Yemen recognize government bad, hypocritical. I disagree, because you actually have to look at the history of what happened here. Turkey after 8 months of Haftar. Now, I would have been against what Haftar did regardless. In 2014, I would have been against what the Houthis were doing regardless. The thing is, the Houthis were successful. Haftar was not. Haftar launched an offensive. Haftar has been a spoiler in the peace process. Actually, I think probably in similar but less effective ways than the Houthis were spoilers in the peace process in Yemen. And I think that is an interesting parallel. And actually, maybe that's a good video to do, talking about how Haftar and the Houthis are somewhat similar players. The thing is, Haftar fucking failed. Haftar's promise when he launched his offensive against the internationally approved government in April of 2019, when he launched that offensive, his promise was, we're going to take this whole country back. It's going to be a unified place with a unified government. We're going to do it in 2 months' time. A year later, he had failed to make it past the suburbs of Tripoli. He had not done it. He had failed. He had been stopped. Because the Russians I think because the UAE started paying for Russian mercenaries, he all of a sudden started making more progress. And then at that point, the Turks did step in and sort of save that government. The GNA. The GNA always had more legitimacy, more power, and more. Now, I'm not saying that the government of national accord in Libya is a powerful, legitimate, or effective force compared to most anything in the world. I am saying that compared to the Yemeni government based in Riyadh, it is an infinitely more powerful, effective, and legitimate force. The GNA was never uprooted. The GNA has been the government in Tripoli, has international representatives. It is a real thing. It is a weird ragtag of fucked up militias with serious problems that is governing poorly. Oh, I 100% grant you all of that. However, it's got territory. It's got legitimacy. It's got governing figures. It's got, this sort of thing. It's basically what the Houthis are. The Houthis, absolutely, I think, were disruptive in similar ways in like the 2012 to 2014 to the way that Haftar has been to peace processes in Libya up until 2014. But what the Houthis did was they actually won. And they didn't win, now. They won back in the end of 2014. They sent the Hadi government scuttling off to Saudi Arabia. If Haftar had succeeded in his offensive, and was it al-Sarraj and all the other militia leaders had run off to Tunisia and Turkey, then we'd say, okay, like, cool, let's. I mean, this sucks, but you know what? Peace. Let's do it. Like, it's a war that is over. The Houthis created a war that was over in 2015. They had forced out Hadi. They were in control of the country. And that's when Saudi Arabia decided to jump in and claim that Hadi was somehow legitimate, governing from Riyadh. So I think that's the key thing here. The GNA has always had power in Libya. Hadi has not had power in Yemen since 2014. Hadi is completely shored up by the Saudis, has no other source of legitimacy, is not resident in Yemen, and this is key, over 5 years, Saudi Arabia has been brutalizing Yemen, has maintained an embargo, has poured in probably a couple $2 billion a week for 5 years now in an attempt to unseat the Houthis. And they have failed miserably. The Houthis are vastly more legitimate. So I think actually the Houthis and the government of national accord have a lot more in common. But I mean, let's be honest, like the Houthis are legitimate and victorious. The GNA is sort of legitimate and, a little shaky. And, Haftar, had he been victorious, would, have more legitimacy up like here. And the legitimacy that Houthi and the fucking Saudi based official government of Yemen has is, I'm on the 5th story of a building here. It's all the way down in the sidewalk. Like it's very different situations. But I think that's a very perceptive question, and I think an interesting thing, because yeah, absolutely, on the face of it, yeah, I support Turkey's support of the internationally recognized government, and I do not support Saudi Arabia's support of the internationally recognized government. Sorry, I support Turkey's support of the internationally recognized government in Libya. I do not support the Saudi support for the internationally recognized government in Yemen, and that's because I acknowledge the basic facts of what these governments are, what the powers they have are, what their histories are, what their legitimacy is, what their success is. But I do think that's a very perceptive comment, and thank you for bringing that up. But yeah, they are two very different situations, though, yes, superficially they do seem the same. And that's a very good point. I should even do a video on that, I think. Thank you. Okay. Questions. Local Cool Extreme asks, why are Trumpists so delusional on the fact that Trump lost? Like, how can they not see that many people hate Trump and voted against him? I think it's a problem. I think it's the media as a real true realist. Did you have another question? Yeah, I don't know, man. Like it's weird. Like, people in the comments are just sort of like at every step, they're like, nope, still a chance. Like, I think it's easy to demonize and think negatively of these poor deluded people who believe this, fantastical bullshit. But I think what's important to remember is that the president of the United States is feeding them fantastical horseshit bullshit. Like, the president of the United States, certainly not on foreign policy, as any viewer of this channel will, I think, understand. But like, generally speaking, if the president of the United States is speaking, declaratively about certain basic things about how the U.S. government works, and faces the people, like, generally speaking, they're not. I think I can't blame people for expecting that to not be an outright bald-faced lie. But yeah, there is a president who has dedicated followers who he lies to, and I think that's the key. And I think that it's interesting over the coming weeks to sort of watching that sort of all fall away, which is what we're going to be doing. I'm very confident. It's either that or a civil war. So yeah, I don't know. It's a fascinating thing, and it's important to remember, of course, that like. It's funny. I spent some time at Christmas with a friend who's he's roommates with one of my best friends from high school, and so we're all hanging out, and we're just sort of shooting the shit. And he's very conscious of he's as brain broke as I am. He follows the events as religiously as I do. He certainly knows much more. He's a real journalist, this, that, and everything. And man, he just completely believes that the Russia hoax was, real. That, the entire assumption that, Putin stole the election and this, that, and the other thing. And, I would give him facts. I would be like, look, like, there was no collusion found. These people were fucking idiots. Like, they couldn't collude with Russia. And I've been saying that since 2016, and he's like, yeah, but Manafort, or but and it's just like, so yeah, I mean, a lot of people will just believe what they're told if they believe that the person telling them that is on their side. And I think that's the key thing with a lot of these delusional folks who think that Pence can fill out a form different, and Trump will be president for another 4 years. I think that's rooted in, somebody that they believe in, somebody that they trust is telling them things that simply aren't true. And I think it's sad, but it's also more universal than we'd like. I think it's that, combined with sort of the fantasies of the Russia hoax, is sort of an indicator that, actually, like, believe less stuff. You know, it's funny because I want to say research more or whatever, and I want to say stuff like that, but of course that's the famous mantra of Q and QAnon is do the research yourself, and I mean like it's funny just how goddamn important it is to read books now. I spend way too much time on Twitter. I don't actually. I have been watching a little more TV recently, but like it's so important that you just read books because I mean, more and more, even the sort of information that we find online is infinitely malleable. Like if you just buy a book that will tell you what the history is, like you're gonna have a much better sense of reality. And I think that's so. Yeah, I mean, don't do the research by finding some forum somewhere or some parler account who tells you, or even a Twitter account, or CNN, or MSNBC, or Fox News. Don't believe those fuckers either. Read books. Um, find information in a hard copy that cannot be changed. The older the better. And by older in the sense, I mean something that's 5 years old, because the context, it's really funny, like just the stuff that it used to be a sort of liberal thing to be a little more suspicious, especially in the aftermath of the Iraq War, to be more suspicious of our security agencies, the military industrial complex, this and the other thing. Then Obama comes up and, all of a sudden it's great because Obama's leading it. And now that, a lot of the national security freaks are sort of the hashtag resistance to Trump, or at least will be for the next 20 days or so. It's become common to, just idolize the FBI, the CIA, this, that, and the other thing. And I think if you just become more aware of how people were thinking about things 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago, you'll be so much better armed and better suited to dealing with bullshit. Like I'm sure I fall for bullshit. Like I was totally on board with the standard bullshit when the Syrian war, even after I'd started doing YouTube stuff. I didn't make any videos on it because I was sort of a little suspicious, but it was honestly like, it was funny. I remember it was a very, very, very attractive woman who was, in retrospect, very clearly, I don't say, oh, she was MI6. No, but I mean, she was a woman who went to snooty schools in Britain, and she's like, oh yeah, you should really start doing videos about the Syrian war. She was this, she was doing public relations for one obscure militia in the opposition to Assad. And it was funny because it was actually like this woman pushing me into suggesting that I look into Syria more in the hopes that I would, be making, strident anti-Assad videos that actually sort of convinced me to look at things a little more deeply. But I think the point that I'm trying to make, other than just being like, wow, man, the women I hung out with in Istanbul were so much more attractive. Well, that's not true. I hang out with very attractive people. Anyway, clearly, I have no idea what I'm talking about. But what I'm trying to say is like it's easy to get fooled. I get fooled all the time. Everybody gets fooled all the time. So I think the instinct to be like, oh, those fucking idiots is probably unwise because there's something that I'm being a fucking idiot about for sure. And I think that when we see some fucking idiot completely imbibing some political or religious philosophy, I think it should inspire us to look at our own, what's the bullshit we believe? Because I'm sure I believe a lot of bullshit. So anyway. Victory TRD asks, Moff, who's Moff? Presumably me. Do you believe in God? All caps lock. I have no confidence one way or the other on that one. I find that fundamental belief that some scripture, that somebody figured out exactly what God wants, I find that absolutely ridiculous. I also find strident atheism, that somebody has figured out completely that God doesn't exist. I find that just as stupid. So yeah, I'd say I'm pretty enthusiastically agnostic, with zero sympathy for any organized religion. So yeah. No, I mean, like, no, I think that if people are into sort of organized religion, that's great. I think if I had kids, I'd definitely want to bring them to church. Probably the Episcopalian church, which is the one I was raised in, which is just about as like, who gives a fuck? It's sort of like a drinking club. That's nominally a faith community. But no, I think it's important, these traditions. I think that's an important part of any upbringing. It's an important part of culture and understanding of the world. But yeah, do I believe the Bible is real? Fuck no. I think the Bible's hilarious. Do I believe the Quran is real? I mean, I won't say it quite as loudly, but no. Do I believe that, yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know if there's a God. And pretty sure if there's a God, I couldn't give a shit less what I have to say or think. It might be, in my grimmer, I'm sort of like, my religious views might be a little more H.P. Lovecraft by way of Hegel than they are monotheistic or what have you. Anyway, that's fun. It's probably best for me and the things I cover on this channel to not delve into too deeply into religion. Ahmet CI says, is it J? Turkish? Anyway, says China overtaking US economically by 2028. True or not? I'd say, yeah, definitely. I believe that. I mean, GDP is, you all know at this point that gross domestic product is a weird measure. It's even acknowledged by most people. Because there's two measures of gross domestic product, the sort of nominal terms, which is sort of the, what the weight of an economy is and sort of trade relations between states, and then purchasing power parity, which sort of fucks with the numbers in another way. But of course, it's not like the gross domestic product numbers are anything other than an estimate. So yeah, it's like, who knows what any of this really means? But according to the PPP figures, China became, meaning like what you can buy in a given place with a given, unit of currency or measurement. By PPP measures, the Chinese economy is supposedly already larger than the U.S. economy. And by 2028 now, now by nominal figures as well, the Chinese economy is supposed to surpass the U.S. economy. A lot can happen in 8 years. So yeah, who knows? I mean, whether that is actually going to happen, whether that arbitrary point is actually going to be passed, who knows? I mean, there are a lot of things that could go wrong. I mean, China could fall into crisis. The U.S. could fall into crisis, and it could happen even sooner. Though, of course, if the U.S. falls into crisis, then all of our ways of measuring these concepts get even more ridiculous. I don't know. I mean, there's a part of me, sort of encouraged by, thinkers like, Peter Zeihan or others who are just sort of like, the whole China thing could just fall apart. But that's a very small part of me. I think that this assumption that, China is just on the cusp of falling apart is, I think, unwise and incorrect. I do believe that China's got serious, serious crises in its future, as does the United States, and I think a little more serious in China. But I firmly believe that the story of the 21st century is going to be, that's the century we're in right now, is going to be competition between the U.S. and China. Unless, of course, that competition goes nuclear, and then after that point, the story of humanity becomes nothing. Or no, just starts over, which would be a real shame. Yeah, I think that China could very well have a larger economy than the United States by 2028 in nominal as well as PPP terms. What that actually means for the way the world works is, it depends entirely on how the United States manages what happens from then on, or actually what happens from now on. What happens from 1990 on, and unfortunately we haven't done the best fucking job. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think it's entirely possible that by nominal terms, China will be a bigger economy than the US in 2028. Though I'm honestly a little surprised it's taken that long. It'd be nice if the US took steps necessary to improve Economic growth. What's interesting is we actually have very straightforward paths towards more impressive economic growth, basically making it easier to build buildings in rich areas. Like, that's amazing how much of a difference that would make. So I don't know. It's a fascinating question. It's a question that this channel will continue to deal with, forever, or as long as there is this channel. So yeah, that's a great question. But I think I've said stuff about it. Okay. Wow, we're still talking about religious stuff, huh? DSM 0305. Did I miss a super chat? Oh man, it's getting a little bright in here and I can't see the damn. No, I guess I didn't. That's the last one from True Realist. Okay, I was going to answer a DSM 0305 question. What are your thoughts regarding the Afghanistan peace talks? That's something actually to get worried about. So as I think I've mentioned a couple times in this live chat, there's the real question of what is Biden's political capital going to look like? Like, how much political capital can he spend? Like, if we actually get the Iran nuclear deal again, then yeah, he's not going to be able to do other things. So yeah, I think that I think we're going to still be in Afghanistan at the end of the Biden administration, and I think that's a goddamn shame. But the most important thing, as I hope I will make clear on this channel by the time Biden is inaugurated, the most important thing is that the United States gets back into the Iran nuclear deal. That is the first step towards peace with Iran. And I hope that, as was, I believe, intended with the Iran nuclear deal back in 2015, that there be a growing period of normalization and dealing with other issues. I think that if we become, if we get into bed, if we have 4 years, which should be possible, because it seems as though it would not be it would be an extraordinarily politically difficult thing for Biden to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. But as far as like what needs to happen for that to happen, it doesn't look like there's much. I think Biden can just essentially make it happen. However, having done that, he's also going to need to show how tough he is, how this, that, and the other thing he is. Blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I don't think there's going to be progress on Libya or Afghanistan or I gotta pray. My main concern after the Iran nuclear deal is getting our troops out of Syria. I think that's a really important step that we can take that would solve so many problems. But yeah, I just fucking, as dumb as it is that we're in Afghanistan, and the fucking hell of it is that as soon as competition with China, ratchets up a bit, our military occupation right on the Chinese border, even though that exacerbates. Like, if we didn't have US troops in Afghanistan, would China be as interested in crushing everyone in Xinjiang? Maybe, but probably not as extreme as they are now. And it's funny because I don't see a lot of people making that argument, but we're 2 years from now when sort of China hawkery is even more just standard. People are going to be talking about, well, hey, that's, Afghanistan shares a border with China, so it's good for us to be there. So yeah, man, I'm getting less and less, which is, I think, why it might be a good thing to vote for in the contest that's ongoing right now to decide what the next new big topic for the United States for the United States. I believe that the More Freedom Foundation has the foreign policy the United States should have, but we're having a contest to see what the next big topic is, and Afghanistan, Pakistan, India is one of those topics. So maybe you want to sign up for Patreon and vote for that. But yeah, I am not optimistic about the chances of a U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, even though I believe that would be absolutely the best idea. Okay, True Realist is More Freedom Foundation. My question is above the super chat. I forgot to link it. Oh dear, now I have to find that super chat again. Where did it go? Oh, no, damn it. Okay. True realist above the super chat. Okay, true realist. I live in Europe, and I feel the Libya situation is causing a lot of friction and what has been a very broken union recently. Hence the Libya focus now. That's it. That's very interesting, actually, because I think France and Germany are to some extent on opposite sides of the Libya equation. Germany basically being like, "Yo, why are you fucking with?" France, why are you fucking with Turkey and causing these problems with, all our guest arbiters, all our guest workers? So yeah, that's a very interesting, that is sort of an interesting point. Libya is important to me. It is not important to US policymakers in any way, as I think just a quick glance at their past decade makes clear. However, Libya is very important. And I think that's the case that I've made on here before, is that if Europe is truly interested in slowing flows of migration, slowing flows of migration, I think that's a very big interest of theirs, then they need to be interested in peace and prosperity in Northern Africa, because that's the buffer. Those are the buffer countries. And by enriching those countries and making them peaceful, making a desert and calling it peace seems to be what they've been doing so far. But yeah, it is so much in Europe's interest for the war in Libya to stop, and for you've already got this like world historical opportunity of a functioning democracy in Tunisia. Efforts should be made to help that spread. Diplomatic, for the love of Christ, not. And that's what's so frustrating about Libya, is just that it's Europeans, because it's not just, I think Italy, hilariously, Italy is on Turkey's side in Libya. It's just a tremendous clusterfuck. And I think the Europeans should, despite the fact that their leadership destroyed the country, the European leadership should be taking a unified interest in bringing peace and prosperity back to Libya. And instead, they're just dicking around over oil contracts and screwing themselves and all of Africa. It's a real goddamn shame. All right, questions. Hafiz Farouk asks, Mo Freedom Foundation, what do you think the Islamic world should expect for the next 4 years from Joe Biden's foreign policy? Well, what's the Islamic world? I think that's a difficult question in and of itself. I would hope that, I think that for a lot of the Islamic world, maybe the only thing unifying the Islamic world is concern for the Palestinian cause. And I would say prepare to be disappointed. Honestly, I think that by pushing back against Netanyahu just in the slightest way, I think it'd be very relieving for the Arab world or the Islamic world or what have you. And I think that there's possibilities of that. But is the embassy going to be moved back out of Jerusalem? No. But actually, I think there might be much more real scope with the Biden presidency of giving the Israelis more shit for repression. I think there's a much smaller likelihood of Netanyahu deciding, oh, I can go scorched earth in Gaza again. Those are positive aspects. I would argue it's certainly not the case. Arab governments, most Arab governments at this point, wouldn't see it as in their interest. But I certainly believe it is in the Arab and Muslim world's interest for the U.S. to get into the Iran nuclear deal. I think that whether you're a incredibly hawkish, U.S. foreign policy, war and bombs crazy, or you're a pacifist, it is in the U.S. interest, no matter how defined, to get the fuck out of the Middle East, and it is also in the interest of the people living there that we do so. I think the most important next step to do that, to freeing the Middle East from the clutches of the U.S. military-industrial complex, is jumping back into the Iran nuclear deal and regularizing relations between the United States and Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Israel as soon as humanly possible. If Biden does that, which is as of December 26, 2020, still looks like a very real possibility. I think that would be a tremendous gift for the Islamic world. I don't know. I don't know whether folks, thinkers, or governing folks in the Islamic world would agree on that. I don't even know what the Islamic world is, but I hope that's an adequate answer to your question. DSM 0305, what is your thoughts regarding Pakistani support for Taliban, and do you see any resemblance to Saudi war in Yemen? I don't know enough about Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistani support for the Taliban. My understanding is that, yes, Taliban has been pretty strongly supported by Pakistan. So Saudi war in Yemen, I would say that the Taliban has been much more strongly supported by Pakistan than, say, the Houthis have been supported by Iran, for sure. I would also say that the Pakistani support for the Taliban has been dramatically more successful than the Saudi support for the Houthi government in Yemen. But the extent to which Pakistan, I don't even know what Pakistan's current relationship with the Taliban is. I assume it's official condemnation with heavy support, but I don't know. Sorry, just don't know enough about it. Questions, which is another reason why, perhaps, if you were interested, you could sign up for Patreon and vote over the next 5 days through December 31st. Folks have the opportunity to choose what I will be doing for the next year or two. What will the next big focus for this channel be? Will it be Israel-Palestine? That's an option. Will it be Afghanistan, Iran, Jesus Christ, Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan? That's an option. Or will it be the history of U.S. empire more generally? That too is an option. If you sign up for Patreon and vote right now. Anyway, I will continue to pitch that. This is, of course, for those who are recently coming on, I'm doing three live chats this week in an effort to get more people to sign up for Patreon and to vote on what my next big project will be. I'm doing this one today on the Houthis, I think either on the 28th or maybe the 29th. I'm trying to actually do a 3 live chats and a produced video over the next week. I may give up and not do the produced video, in which case I will not do the live chat on the 28th. I'll do it on the 29th. But yeah, the next 2 live chats, I think one is going to be a 2020 year in review, which would be fucking grim, and a 2021 forecast. What do I think might happen? Or maybe rather what's important for 2021. So those are the live chats that are coming up this week in an effort to convince all of you to please sign up on Patreon and vote for what my next big topic will be. Okay, questions. No more super chats, huh? It's understandable as I'm doing 4 live chats this month instead of just 1. Okay. Questions. Do we have some questions? Okay, Local Cool Extreme, More Freedom Foundation. Recently, you described Marco Rubio's complaints on the coming. Oh shit, where'd it go? Recently, you described Marco Rubio's complaints on the coming Democratic Chief of Staff, calling Republicans as illegitimate. Do you think her comments hurt bipartisanship? You mean like when some incoming Democratic staffer called Republicans motherfuckers? No, I don't think that hurt bipartisanship. I would like to see a little more salt from Democrats. Frankly, I'd like to see a little more. Yeah, I don't think that's a big deal. I think the Republicans have been doing scorched earth for quite some time, and Democrats don't need to be so careful about their language. Yeah, I remember it was like a month long, felt like a month long news cycle when back in 2018 when Rashida Tlaib said a Democratic representative said, "Yeah, let's impeach that motherfucker," and that makes sense to me. So yeah, no, I don't, you know what, like we're gonna worry about dirty language. Well, Mitch McConnell blocks any kind of social provision for a country that's, dying of disease and whatnot. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's some warrant for civility. I mean, I don't think. Yeah, sure. People in power should be polite. Etiquette is important. It is important that the Democrats should attempt to observe a higher, more rigorous standard. That's what they've been doing. If it weren't for the Democrats, the United States would be a smoking ruin. For it seems like for 20 years now, we have the Republicans come in and break everything, and the Democrats come in and fix things. We need the Democrats to keep coming in and fixing things. So yeah, no, I think sure, you shouldn't have potty mouthed staffers or this, that, and the other thing. But comparing, I think that's as a general principle, sure. But the comparing that to just the general run of Republican office holders undermining the Constitution, calling everybody evil socialists, yeah, they're fuckers. It's pure and simple. They're lying sacks of shit. But yes, I do think people in government probably shouldn't be speaking the way that YouTubers can speak. Do I think she should be penalized in any way for that? No. Do I think that it merited the amount of discussion that we all had about it? No. Okay. I missed another super chat. Shit. Where'd it go? Where did it go? I was too interested in. Fuck. So the sun is in my face, so I can't actually see. Okay, where that's. I missed a super chat. I apologize. All right. True Realist. Thoughts on the U.S. Libya Stabilization Act? I don't know what that is, True Realist. Sorry. Yeah, I have no idea. I should Google it. That sounds like an interesting thing. Yeah, it's embarrassing now that the big data, the big concern with Libya. I mean, Libya is actually a slightly healthier, happier place than it has been for quite some time. With the defeat of Haftar's offensive in that was June of this year. Libya is a little calmer, so perhaps I don't pay as much attention as I ought to. Early next month, we've got another patrons-only newscast. And if this is a new thing, U.S. Libya stabilization sounds great. But knowing the U.S. Congress, maybe it's saying, we should back up Haftar or something. I don't know. But I don't know what that is. I will look into what that is. Because I got caught out on another one of these live chats, not realizing that the Libyan government had supposedly most Libyan actors had committed to elections in December of 2021, which was kind of a big deal I was not aware of. So yeah, I think even for me, now that ongoing fighting seems to have diminished, I think Libya is just sort of falling off my mind, and I apologize for that. All right. So yeah, sorry, True Realist. I wish I had more to say about the Libya Stabilization Act, but I don't even know what it is. Was that another super chat I missed? Nope. Why? So it's interesting. My for the live chats, my interface is all black, and I can't. So and the slider for the chat is like a little bit gray, and so I can't actually see it, which is very irritating. Apologize for missing that super chat. Man. James Cook asks, will Indonesia recognize Israel's statehood as the UAE and Morocco did? Man, I don't even know. I mean, does Indonesia not recognize Israeli statehood? I got to confess, it's not something that I have done a study of. I mean, it's possible that, it's just generally they don't have any direct relations, but Indonesia is pretty far away. Yeah, I don't have any insight into that. But Indonesia is actually a democracy. So that would be if Israel did have a similarly fraught relationship with Indonesia, it would be much more difficult for Indonesia to change that, would be my assumption. It's also entirely possible the Indonesians just don't care about Israel as much. I don't know. Politics Ideology asks, what do you think about Iranian foreign minister interview with Tolo News? I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm feeling so uninformed. I apologize. Politics Ideology. What do you think about Iranian foreign minister? I don't know. I'll look into it though. Iranian FM Tolo. I mean, I have been following what the Iranian foreign minister has said. Javid Zarif. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. Says in some contexts, and I think their position is very straightforward. It's the U.S. Ought to get back into this deal, and we can start doing negotiations once the U.S. rejoins the deal, and that's a very straightforward, appropriate position that I support entirely. Yeah, so there. Angel Belanzar asks, when will Assad finally kick out the Turks from Syria? The problem is that's not how the Turks are leaving Syria, I'm afraid, because the Turks are going to be there. I think until the Turks decide to leave. I think that was actually established quite directly. Was it earlier? Was it spring 2019? Has it been that long already? Or was it, no, it was the fall of 2019. No, it was the spring of 2019, right? No shit, it was this spring. Essentially, it was during COVID. Assad got cute and bombed a bunch of Turkish military positions, killed a couple dozen Turks, and the Turkish government just started rolling across northern Syria, wiping up in a couple days' time territory that had taken Assad months and months to take away from the rebels. And it was only Russia intervening and saying, hey, Erdo, knock it off, that kept the Turks from rolling through Aleppo. Even Assad backed by Russia, does not have the power or the ability to dislodge Turkey physically from Syria. That's just not going to happen. It's got to be a negotiated end there. It's unfortunately, I could very easily see it becoming a new frozen conflict, sort of a Russo-Turkish Cold War. The only way that Turkey would be physically pushed out of there would be if the U.S. completely abandoned Turkey. And I don't even think that would happen if Turkey was pushed out of NATO. I think that the U.S. would retain some kind of alliance with Turkey. So yeah, I just don't see that happening. I mean, 50 years from now, when the entire geopolitical constellation is completely different, yeah, maybe, I don't know, I don't fucking know, maybe 50 years from now, the support of the U.S. will be meaningless in the Middle East. I'd be surprised, but that could be the case. And maybe, yeah, I don't know, maybe Israel and Assad team up to kick the Turks out of kick the Turks out of Syria. I find that unlikely, but yeah. But as far as short term, Assad kicking the Turks out of Syria, that's not That's a decades off kind of thing. The only hope, and it is a hope that I think we should all endorse, is some kind of negotiated end to the conflict between those two. More Freedom Foundation says, thoughts on the Chinese Alex Jones going on to Memory TV to gloat about COVID screwing over the U.S. So Memory is fascinating because they do try to sell themselves as, misleadingly sell themselves as, a unified cultural product. But no, what Memory TV is a bunch of researchers in Washington, D.C. With, certainly indirect and probably some under the surface direct connection to the U.S. government. They just go find clips. They just found a clip of that Chinese guy on YouTube to translate and then put out under their name. That's what they do. I mean, they find sometimes it is legitimate commentary in Arabic. Like Al Jazeera is famously its English language version is a pretty good news product, whereas its Arabic language version is much more extreme and can be very kind of horrifying when you translate what they're actually saying to a English language viewer. But also, what memory does is they don't just do Al Jazeera clips. They go deep. They go find like some video. I mean, not anymore, but they'd go find some videotape from some obscure cleric in one country or another that wasn't circulated in any official or broad capacity, and translate that and be like, look, see, look at this evil shit that everybody in the Middle East believes. And that's obviously what they did with that sort of Chinese Alex Jones clip you were talking about. So yeah, like Memory TV is not a TV channel. It is not. It is a outfit that finds the worst clips possible about a given society and translates them into English so as to convince U.S. policymakers and the U.S. public to be more afraid and to hopefully bomb more people in service of U.S. defense contractors. That's what Memory TV is. It's not an actual TV channel. Okay. Fun fact: Israel has started to kill. Questions. Angel Balanzar says, will the entire Middle East start normalizing ties with Israel? That appears to be what's happening, which I find quite surprising. And I think it's interesting is to question what exactly normalization means. There's been very little in the status of these countries that has changed dramatically. I believe the UAE actually supposedly is allowing Israelis to come visit, but there are problems with the implementation. And I think that's often been the case. Egypt and Israel have nominally had normalized ties since 1970 something or other, but Israelis are not allowed. I don't think with personal safety, they can't go anywhere in Egypt other than certain resort areas. Yeah. So yeah, what does it actually mean? But yeah, it seems as though if the Trump administration had continued, we would have seen a lot of these. We probably would have seen a continued raft of normalization deals. The question is what those actually mean in practice. Abbas Mohammed asks, More Freedom Foundation, do you support the Houthi cause? I absolutely, I don't support whatever the Houthis stand for in religious terms, or I don't much like the idea of the Houthis running all of Yemen. However, that is the facts on the ground. And I think that the Houthis could be forced to acknowledge other aspects of Yemeni culture and politics much more readily if they didn't have an invasion to fight off that unites people in objection to that invasion. Do I support the Houthi goal of kicking every last element of Saudi influence out of Yemen? Absolutely. Do I support the Houthis, the political entity, or think that their heroes are awesome or anything? No, of course not. Local Extreme asks, Mo Freedom Foundation, I've noticed recently a massive dip in Islamophobia in all my circles on the internet. Is this a genuine positive change in the internet or successful US anti-China propaganda? Well, I think what you have to acknowledge is it's not like propaganda forcing people to do something. It is the absence of a high level of propaganda. From 9/11 until probably the issuance of the new defense strategy in the beginning of January 2018, the US government and a whole bunch of actors affiliated with the US government had a strong interest in fostering Islamophobia. That means that, there's never official government programs. However, there absolutely were, things like Jihad Watch or, Pam Geller, any number of a wide, Gatestone Institute. John Bolton was on the board of the Gatestone Institute. All these nasty, shitty little organizations or whatnot that had this very reliable stream of funding from, never directly. I mean, it's not like there's a line item for the Gatestone Institute at the CIA or something like that, but it's like, it's, people who recognize that their interests are in the US government bombing more places, like the people who work at defense industry outfits, the folks who work for, there are ways in which money can get to certain ideological positions without, a direct connection to the U.S. government. What happened in 2018 with that new defense strategy was that the U.S. finally, which it had always wanted to do, the U.S. government finally came out and said directly, we're no longer interested in fighting this terrorism that you gave us all this money to fight. We've obviously failed miserably in doing that. So we're more interested in setting up great power competition, or the sort of politics of pre-World War I. We explicitly want to do that now. And when that became what they wanted to do, all of that money, all of that spare stuff is now flowing towards, I don't know, China Uncensored or the Epoch Times, or, other outfits that, occasionally make very good points against the horrors of the Chinese government, but are there to make people afraid of China and the Chinese. That's where that discretionary funding is going now. So it's not like, there was some careful propaganda effort that was like, we're not making fun of it. It's not like somebody at the CIA was like, or the State Department was like, we no longer, we want you to be scared of China instead of the Muslims now. It's just the funding for Islamophobia is drying up. And so therefore people care less about the Muslims. I've absolutely noticed that as well. It really is nostalgic now when somebody crops up in my comments and is like, they're going to swamp Europe and they're going to, they're bringing Sharia everywhere. I'm just like, oh, that's adorable. It's like somebody talking about horse and buggy whips, or, how much they love their BlackBerry. It's, you remember BlackBerries, that sort of mobile phone that doesn't, maybe the company still exists, but it was, for a moment there in the early 2000s, it was a huge deal, and now it's gone. And I think that's sort of what's happening to the Islamophobia industry, sort of as we speak. They aren't given the resources to put their message out. And it's a dumb message. So yeah, it's fading away. Okay, we are at the 2-hour mark. That just breezed by. So I'm gonna start pitching. I'm going to start trying to sell you on a number of things that I would like you to buy. And but if there's another super chat, I will definitely answer that question. But yeah, the reason that I'm doing 3 live chats and maybe even a produced video, 4 videos this week, is I'm trying to get people to sign up on Patreon. The sort of quick benefit that I provide is that if you sign up before December 31st, you get to vote on what this channel's next big project is. I've written 2 books, one rather short, one rather large, around big picture concepts. One of them was called Everybody's Lying About Islam, and that focused on the US-Saudi relationship and how much it screwed everything up. I've got a series of, 41 videos directly related to that concept, and a whole bunch of other videos that are related to that concept as well. So that was like a big project for this channel in like 2017, 2018, 2019, and still ongoing. Then there's Avoiding the British Empire, which was a very thick book that I would recommend you read. It's available in paperback and on the Amazon Kindle. And it basically, it's sort of a stealth history of the modern world and how the British Empire sort of forcibly and brutally knit the world together in one world system, which is, of course, the same world system that the US sort of runs today. So that is sort of like a stealth history of the world. It talks about all manner of the British things about the British Empire that people just don't like to focus. I'm very proud of the fact that it's a very thick book that's got about, I think, 3 paragraphs on World War II. And more on World War I, because actually that's more significant for what happened to the British Empire. But it's something that you don't see enough of. It really goes into what the British Empire was, what it controlled, how how similar it is to the U.S. world system, the U.S. empire, and the fact that the U.S. is making similar mistakes. There's a book on that. There's an ongoing series. I have a lot more I want to do with that series. But I, kept getting derailed this year by coronavirus, among other things. So those were my 2 big projects. The Everybody's Lying About Islam book came out back in 2017. The Avoiding the British Empire book came out in fall of 2019. So what I want the patrons of this channel to do, the crowdfunders of this channel to do, is decide what my next big project is. Is it going to be Israel-Palestine? Is it going to be, I think I would write a book if it was Israel-Palestine. Is it going to be Afghanistan, Pakistan, India? I don't think I'm going to, even after 2 years of study, I don't think I'm going to yet be brave enough to write a book about that. But who knows? Maybe I'll find something that really needs to be addressed in a coherent book-like way. But there would definitely be a long series of videos about that, and it would become part of sort of, the base level of expertise of this channel, and it would be something we would cover a lot if folks opted for Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. And if the third option is just U.S. empire. I did a British Empire book. So to sort of finish my history of the world, I need to do a U.S. empire book, which I would argue sort of starts out from the 19 teens and sort of talk about the ways that I just did a trailer video that I'm actually very proud of. I'm kind of sad it's in the context of a trailer video. It's sort of talking about the way that Thucydides sort of shows that the U.S. is falling down this slope into imperial brutality that we need to worry about. And that's sort of, just one element of the story that I would like to tell if sort of the history of the U.S. empire became the focus. So those are the three options. I would be delighted if you signed up for Patreon and decided to vote for one of those options. There's a number, it's a little bit complicated because you got to sign up for Patreon and then you got to go find the post where you can vote. It's been up for a month. But I put a link, I think I put a link to it in this description, a lot of other places. So, you should be able to find it. I want people to do that. But also there is the patrons only live chat that I do every month. If you sign up for Patreon, you get to do that. There's obviously a lot of topics that folks want me to cover in detail, but in a produced video form, I can really, or even a more prepared live chat, I can really only do 6 or 7 topics in a given month. And sometimes those will be the same topic if I think it's an important enough thing to dive into. But on the live chats, I go item by item. A couple days before, I ask what people really want to hear about, what patrons really want to hear about. And I go through the whole list of 10 to 12 things. I cover things that I think are important, in news, politics, business, economics, whatever. And I also cover, I make a point of if there's been any development in countries that I've covered a lot, like Libya or North Africa and such, and I make point of putting that in. And I also cover things that patrons want me to talk about. So, and it's fantastic. Like I got to know a lot more about Bolivia than I would have otherwise because I had one patron who really, Scott Locks, really wanted me to cover Bolivia. And I'm glad that I did because it really enriched my knowledge of Latin America in a way that few things have. So yeah, I think that the patrons only newscast is a lot of fun. I go item by item, and there's usually few enough people that show up that we can actually have a full-on discussion. I deal with every comment, and that's a really fun thing that I offer to patrons. And also just generally, like we're getting to a point where media is just getting more and more beaten down. What's fascinating over the past couple months, more and more folks, journalists and opinion leaders are just deciding like, screw it, I'm just going to go out on my own. I'm just going to do my own thing because there isn't the funding for me anymore at these other organizations. And it's like kind of funny. I'm like, that's what I've been doing for 7 years, guys. And I think, unfortunately, because it would be a better world if the New York Times was being critical about American foreign policy, or if every city had multiple newspapers that funded investigative journalism and commentary. It'd be great if we lived in that world, but we don't live in that world anymore. So I think that makes it all the more important that folks contribute to independent media. I don't know. I still wouldn't call myself a journalist. I don't ferret out sources or do the heroic work of actually, deciding what the people should know and the laborious work of ferreting that out. I just read books and read the news and give my interpretation. But I do think that that's valuable. So yeah, that's my hard pitch for Patreon. There's also PayPal. I've got a link for that too if you want to contribute through that. But also the fact that you are merely here, that 48 people are willing to watch and participate in an event like this on something as obscure as the Yemen's, the Houthi designation as a foreign terror organization and what that may or may not mean. That is tremendously important. Just more people interested in the kinds of information that this channel puts forward is a tremendous gift, and I'm tremendously grateful to anybody who shows up and is willing to engage with these concepts. Yes, I do need to eat, and I try to provide extra benefits for patrons. But I am tremendously grateful to anybody who shows up and cares about these things, because they are incredibly important and I think actually entertaining to a degree. I mean, it's fascinating, interesting stuff, what our world is. And I'm really grateful to everybody who shows up. Every Tuesday, I put up a video. Sometimes it's live, sometimes it's more produced. You can find me, I have a website, www.morefreedomfoundation.com. Some more information there. I'm very conscious that it's long past time for an update, but it exists. On Twitter, the conversation continues all day, every day. On Twitter at RoboLaw. Many folks you may know from the comments join me over there. And that's at RoboLaw, ROBBOLAW. You can find me on Instagram at The Golden Age. My branding's not very consistent. I hope to see you all there. I'm tremendously grateful to you folks for showing up. And any last questions? Did I miss any last super chats there? God damn, it's so bright. Why is it so bright? Why is it so bright? Make a video about the Israeli elections, man. Yeah, see, that's the thing. If the Israel-Palestine thing wins, I'm actually going to finally have to figure out how Israeli politics work, which is daunting. But if you guys vote for it, I'll vote for that. How many will take the suicide shot? What are we talking about there? Anyway, is that anti-vax shit? Taz Beat says Yemeni people are thankful that you speak on their behalf. Well, I don't know about that, but that certainly makes me feel like a superhero. All right. What is your opinion of Sisi governments compared to Nasser? I don't like the Sisi government. How about that? All right. Well, there are no more super chats. We've been doing this for 2 hours and 10 minutes. I think I have attempted to sell everything I'm going to attempt to sell. So I think it's probably time to say good day. I think I'll almost certainly, by the end of the day, I'll decide whether I'm doing the next live chat on the 28th or the 29th. I think it'll probably be on the 28th. I've already filmed a produced video. We'll see how much more work I have to do there. I think we'll do a 2020 year in review, most probably on Monday, the 28th, between noon and 2. Don't hold me to that. There's some other stuff I might have to take care of, but that's what I have in mind at this point. Loco Cool Extreme asks, how was your Christmas? My Christmas was great. Thank you. That's very kind. I have been spending a lot of time with my family this year, months and months and months, which is strange for an American who is 42. So after spending 6 solid weeks with my elderly parents, my mom has been sick this year, and she is now, thankfully, seems to be recovering. I opted to spend Christmas in New York City with friends, and it was fantastic. It's COVID, so I've had like maybe 5 or 6 non-family social interactions this year. So it was very nice to sit down with some old friends and eat some dinner and catch up and shoot the shit and watch Wonder Woman and make fun of it. It was a really good Christmas. Thanks, and I hope everyone else is having a fantastic holiday season. And with that, I'll see you all in 2 days for another live stream. It never ends. Thank you all so much. And I thank you for the best wishes for my mom. I think she's, we're hopeful she's on the mend. Cancer is shitty. Anyway, many thanks and a happy holidays to all.